Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the combat zone, where the enemy only has four things to say: abandon ship, bail out, take cover, and I surrender. Have we got a show for you tonight? We're just getting Claire Lopez online. If you don't know Claire, I have had over my media career the opportunity to interview her a number of times, and I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, she's a great interview. She's entertaining. She is very well versed in world affairs. A long history. We put her bio out. Put her bio up. All you have to do is Google Claire Lopez, and you'll find her bio. And I'm not going to relate it to you, but let's say she's got lots of real-world experience in the intelligence and counterintelligence world. So we're working hard on getting her on the air, where she should be with us shortly. And I remember the first time I met her was here in Ottawa. As a matter of fact, you brought her in, did you not?
Hi.
You know what? I did all that and never forgot.
He's Nick and I'm Joe.
That's right. I forgot to let him.
I'm
so excited about our guest tonight.
I was just waiting in the background patiently. Not a problem, Nick. Not a problem at all. I'm used to being a wallflower. I'm the guy that sits in the back of the room quietly and waves my hand, every now and then saying, "Excuse me, can I say something?"
And then when they let him loose, oh my God.
Yeah. Anyway, Claire Lopez is a former CIA officer and also a counterintelligence and national security expert, well versed in international affairs. So we're just waiting for her to jump in online any minute now to call in. So anyway, maybe you'll want to reach out to her there for a second, Nick, and I could keep our audience entertained, telling them all about the snowstorms. I guess there's a lot of people there had that problem with the snow over the past few days.
A lot of people got a few hours behind the handle of a snow shovel. I was one of them.
Yeah, well, I got stuck in my driveway this afternoon, and I spent, it must have been, about half an hour or so I spent shoveling snow. So, I have one of these. I have a Dodge, or not a Dodge, it's a Cobalt. What is that? It's a Chevy Cobalt. I'm not sure that Chevrolet makes them. In fact, I'm not even sure that the Chevrolet brand is in existence anymore. But it's a small car, and it's a front-wheel drive. And so I'm pulling into my driveway, which is a short driveway. We live in a condominium, have a garden home. So the driveway really is only the length of a car. Plus we have a garage. And I got about 3/4 of the way into the driveway. And unfortunately, the snow was up right up at the axle. And I got on top of a snowbank, and my front tires would spin. And that was it. So it's not actually that big a deal. That is to say, it's not really something that we never experience here. Usually 2, 3, 4 times a year, we'll get a dump of snow that's in the 12 to 15 inch range, sometimes a little bit more. And for those of you who are in the metric system, that would be, about 30, 35, maybe as much as 40 centimeters. And we have a service that comes in and plows our laneway, Nick. So it usually works out well, but today, for whatever reason, they were a little late, or they just hadn't gotten around to it yet. And so I was pulling into the laneway there, and I got stuck, and I had to shovel out. But the funny thing is, you have to shovel underneath the car, because you have to get the snow. You have to get it so that the car comes down off of the snow pile and gets actually into or back settled down onto the driveway itself. And then, if you're lucky and it's not too icy, then you can pull in. And that's what ended up happening. But we got two storms in a row. So I guess Friday and Saturday we had probably around 20 centimeters or so, 25 centimeters. And then we had a couple of days break. And then again today, last night and today. And I have to tell you, I was not expecting it. I woke up this morning, looked outside. My wife actually looked outside and said, "Oh, look at all the snow." I go, "Well, yeah, it's Canada, it's Ottawa. Of course we've got a lot of snow." But anyway, there it is. So listen, guys, I'm just taking over here. Nick's just stepped away from the microphone for a minute. He's taking care of a little bit of administrative technical business on the side. So while we're waiting for him and we're waiting for Claire to come online from Virginia, I believe she's calling from tonight. Looking here, our number to call, if you want to join the discussion live tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be toll-free anywhere in North America, 844-415-2115. That number again, 844-415-2115. And of course, you can always join us in the chat room, and we usually have a lot of activity in our chat room. And to do that, you just click on the talk bubble in the live player on the website. And you may have to register, and we don't sell you anything through registration. Nobody bugs you. That's just to ensure that you're a real human being, because we do get a lot of different groups trying to hack us as it happens. Okay, so what else is happening in the world today? I'm just looking at my notes here. As I said, we're just waiting for Nick to get back in front of the microphone. He's taking care of a few technical things, and I'm just scribbling a few things down here. So the winter, I know, while we're killing time here, was it Saturday? It was Friday. Friday, I noticed that the weather, I think it was the Weather Channel, was one of the weather channels, and they made a note, or they observed that the storm that we were experiencing that day was the coldest snowstorm. Now, I'll explain what that means in a second, but the coldest snowstorm that we have had in more than 100 years. The coldest snowstorm. Now, the reason that they're talking this way is because, generally speaking, when you have a snowstorm, the temperature is actually a little warmer. So the temperature warms up somewhat, and then you get the snow. And then when the snowstorm stops and a high-pressure system starts to move in, especially in the wintertime here in Canada, because the high-pressure systems often come out of the Arctic, that's when the temperature gets really cold. So it's very rare to have a heavy snowstorm, a blizzard, with temperatures that are minus 15, minus 19, minus 20 degrees Celsius. Now, minus 18 degrees, for those of you who are not using the metric system outside of Canada, for our American listeners, minus 18 Celsius is 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So once you get into the 0 degrees Fahrenheit zone, very rare to have a heavy snowfall around that temperature, because the snow isn't very heavy. You don't get heavy, thick snowflakes this way. That's the technical side of things. So I don't want to bore you with the technical stuff, okay? I know somebody was saying to me the other day I get too far into the weeds. But I just wanted to set that up so that people understand that there's a reason why you don't really have extreme cold and extreme cold and heavy snow at the same time. Anyway, so this weather network made the observation that this was the coldest snowstorm that we had had in this region, Eastern Ontario, in more than 100 years. Now, I'm just waiting for our friends in the environmental movement to explain how it is that global warming has caused this. Because we all know global warming is the cause of every climate change issue out there. So that's one thing. We're waiting for that. So if any of you out there know the explanation why global warming ought to result in the coldest snowstorm that we've had in more than a century, I'm all ears. Call us, send us a text, tweet, get online and send us a message in the chat room. We'd all like to understand this. We'd all like to know why this is. So the coldest to temperature snowstorm in more than a century. What I want to know, of course, is how is it that banning straws is actually addressing this issue? And that's not an academic. That's not just one of those silly questions, because I visited over the past few days. It must be 6 or 7 establishments where I wanted to get a drink of something. And not a single one of those places did they bring me a straw, Nick. Not one of those places did they bring me a straw. Nick's
You're still on about the straws?
Well, I can't. It's bothering me because they'll give you straws if you ask for them.
Yeah, but now that
I was at a place the other day. My friend and I were in a place the other day, and I asked for a straw for a glass of ice water.
Now,
and the waitress, by the way, gave me. She was not happy that we were asking for straws.
Tough. I will let you know that Claire should be joining us shortly. The little technical glitch we have sorted out, so it should be she should be joining us within a minute. But now it's getting to the point where they're going back to real straws, because the term straw refers to the grain wheat and the long stem, and they would cut the end off and use it like a straw. Well, okay. That's where the term comes from. And they're getting back to that. I have no idea whether that's true or not. It's just fun to think about. When you grow up on a farm.
Go on YouTube and you can see people sampling straw alternatives like stainless steel straws, bamboo straws.
Now stop. Go ahead and take care of that. But I want to ask people a question. What do you think has a greater impact when it comes to the environment? Making 500,000 steel straws or 500,000 plastic ones? I want to know.
Okay, don't confuse the issue. Okay, we're just let's see if we can connect here with Claire. Hang on just a second. Okay, are you there, Claire?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
There, we did it.
Okay,
Yay.
We did it. By the way, let me just ask you this: were you getting a call from us earlier?
I just got a call a few minutes ago, and I spoke with Nick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, for some reason I was trying to dial out because we have this system here, and I guess it just wasn't working properly. So my apologies. Anyway, welcome.
Well, we're connected now, so it's all good. Thank you.
Good. So tell us, just while Nick is working on his computer there, I don't know what he's doing, but I got to ask you just one just innocuous question. What's the weather like down? You're in Virginia, right?
I live in Northern Virginia, yes.
So you guys get hit by any of these snowstorms lately?
Absolutely nothing. It is the lamest winter since the last one.
Claire?
We plod along with temperatures in the 40s and the 50s, and then maybe it rains, and it just never really gets around to winter down here.
Well, here's what we can do for you, Claire. We can pack 150 tractor trailers with 52-foot boxes on them with reefers, and we'll send you all the snow you want at 10 cents a pound.
Oh, no, I don't want to pay for it. I want it for free. I want it to fall from the sky.
Well, I know a bunch of people who would probably contribute to the cost just to cover the fuel to get it down to you, because we've had it up to our eyeballs.
Well, Claire, it's been a while since you've been up here.
I love snow.
It's been a while since you've been up here in Ottawa, so you're welcome to come up here and do some skiing anytime.
And
Thank you
we've
very
got
much.
all kinds of different things we could do. All right. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. You and I have chatted several times over the last decade or so, and I always enjoy our conversations because you're so well versed in what's going on. So let's dive into that. First of all, to Canadian listeners, I think actually one of the largest stories that is in the press in the last little while is this whole Huawei, China, Canada, United States triangle that's been going on. Maybe you can bring us up to speed, because a lot of people are saying, well, look, it was the Americans who asked for us to arrest this woman in the first place, and now we've got people in China who are Canadian nationals who are very literally in fear for their lives. What do you have any inside information about what the American government's doing to help with this situation? Are they doing anything at all? Do they care?
Well, I'm sure they care, but no, I do not have any kind of inside information, only what an informed observer might be seeing. But what this goes to is the heart of, some of the most contentious issues between the United States and China, and I suspect between other countries and China too, whose trade practices have been not just unfair, but predatory. companies from certainly Canada, the United States, will try to enter the market in Canada, in China, one way or the other, either to sell a product, to buy parts or components for things that they're making back at home. And the Chinese typically have demanded arrangements that force the company, the Western company, the outside company, to essentially divulge, to give up all of its intellectual property in order to do anything in the Chinese market. And this is simply wrong. So Huawei is one of the premier high-tech IT companies in China. These companies are all connected to the Chinese Communist Party leadership of the regime. They're not independent companies as we think of them here in the West at all. They're very much tools of the regime, of the communist regime in Beijing. And what Huawei is being accused of is not all of that I was just talking about, but very specifically violating export sanctions on Iran. And so when the daughter of the founder of Huawei was in Canada, as she was there recently, the United States prevailed upon Canada to arrest her in connection with that accusation of violation of the sanctions against Iran. And now, as I understand it, there is an effort underway to have her extradited to the United States to face those charges in court. And I believe that extradition is proceeding.
Yes, as that's the best of our knowledge, too. Now, because one of the things, look, I think a lot of this has to do with the weakness of Canadian leadership under its present with our prime minister and so on. I lay a lot of the blame at his feet. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes? I trust that last week Joseph and I were talking about this, or the week before, how that there's got to be conversations going on with other allies and so on. And it turns out he was right. There was a story in the last few days about how we've been talking. I think the number was 19 different countries.
Right, but where I was wrong, Nick, and I have to give credit where it's due, and you were right. I thought for sure that our prime minister must have already spoken to the president of China, and I insisted that even though there hadn't been a public announcement about it, that these kinds of things, as you know, go on behind closed doors, and
right.
We don't always know what is happening and who's speaking to whom. So I insisted, I said it was inconceivable, I think was the word I used repeatedly, that Prime Minister Trudeau had not had a conversation with the president of China, especially given the fact that this Canadian citizen, this fellow, had his sentence, I don't know what the proper word is, the opposite of commuted, but on appeal from whatever the jail sentence was to now the death penalty for being involved in trafficking drugs. Well, but it turns out, just to finish this, that John McCallum, the ambassador to China, who was in Canada last week, did point out that the Prime Minister had not spoken to the President of China yet, and he might get around to speaking to him at some point in time if the situation calls for it.
Yeah, I won't get into what the families of these Canadian people in China who are now in custody must feel like after that. The question I want to ask Claire is, what could Mr. Trump do to help expedite this situation and come to a much happier resolve than the way it could possibly go right now?
Well, I mean, certainly nobody is threatening any kind of death penalty against the Huawei executive, whether she's extradited or not, faces charges in court or not. That isn't even remotely on the table. So, but there is a lot to be said, obviously, for personal connections among world leaders. It's important that world leaders do develop personal relationships with their counterparts. And, I mean, certainly President Trump has done that with Xi Jinping. And I think this would probably be a timely moment for the Prime Minister of Canada perhaps to do the same. And sometimes these things can be resolved then behind the scenes, even as publicity about it might not be always the very best way to go about it.
Well, let me ask you this, because one of the things that has... Oh, I got to turn my mic on. No? Oh, it is on. Okay. That's what I got Joseph here for, to keep me on the straight and narrow. So let me ask you this. The whole thing with Huawei is this idea that they want to be in the next generation of technology within the internet, something called the 5G network. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, 5G is quantum leap beyond 4G or 3G or anything we've had before. Oh. Part of that has to do with the fact that it is going to be a global system that unifies technologically what they call the Internet of Things. So think about, an intelligent refrigerator that lets its owners know when milk is running low. Think about these devices that are already in a lot of homes that are interactive and listening to your every enunciation, waiting for you to say, please play Jingle Bells. And so it's everything that we have around us, not just smart TVs, computers and all of that, but things, all of these other things, our complete, systems that run our homes from heating to cooling, to everything else you can imagine. That is what 5G is going to be. It's not only cell phones or telecommunications between phone users. It is the Internet of Things. That's what's going to be unified. And the thing is that China has quite a lead on a lot of other countries in the world, including the United States, where a lot of the highest tech equipment, for example, routers for computer equipment, are not even made anymore in the United States. Key components for things like cell phones and these other Internet of Things devices, not made in the United States. So this is a very serious issue, and China is poised to dominate the next generation of technology worldwide, all around us, if some of the rest of us don't up our game pretty quickly.
Okay, so explain to the listener, and me as well, why would you... So we have fridges that know when we're running out of milk. The car maybe can tell you, look, my battery's getting weak. You need to go to Canadian Tire or whatever your outlet is for that down in the States. So in other words, it makes life, I think it makes life too easy, but that's just that's another topic altogether. What is the real big threat here? Is it just economic espionage? What are the security risks from a national security point of view? Can they access military networks and so on?
Well, I know that they certainly try. And we're talking about things that are not just earthbound. We're talking about an entire array of space satellites, space equipment. The connectivity for all of these devices on Earth, the Internet of Things on Earth, all of that will be controlled from outer space. And there, too, the Chinese are aiming for dominance. We may recall that just within the last couple of weeks, the Chinese landed an unmanned spacecraft on the dark side of the moon. This is quite a feat. It is an enormous technological feat that they've accomplished. No, they haven't put a man on the moon, but they landed a spacecraft, unmanned spacecraft, on the dark side of the moon. they are clearly driving for dominance, and it will be space-based. They are aiming to militarize space, to put into orbit not just satellites that will connect the Internet of Things and 5G and all of that cellular communications on Earth, but be in a position to destroy and knock out other countries' networks.
So you're talking about killer satellites?
Sure. And this is why some of the most brilliant people that I know here in the United States, for example, Ambassador Hank Cooper, Peter Pry, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, Dr. William Graham, and many others, who some of them worked way back in the 1980s during U.S. President Ronald Reagan's administrations on space-based defense initiative. We called it the SDI, Space Defense Initiative, and the ability to defend our technological arrays and satellites from attack. That was killed. That whole program was killed for no good reason. But now it's being looked at again, thankfully, by the Trump administration as something that we better take another look at.
So this is basically what you're talking about is Ronald Reagan era Star Wars program. For those people who are old enough and long enough in the tooth to remember that, that's the kind of thing that you're referring to, although that encompassed the missile shield as well. There was a bunch of other things to go with that.
Yes, all of that, yes.
But that's part of the same program.
Space is the new frontier.
Well,
it is certainly not unconnected, but what we're talking about is space-based technology. Everything here on Earth is going to depend on what's up there.
That is just, I don't want to say
he who dominates the up there dominates the Earth.
Yeah, because it's like putting a city under siege. If you can't move around, if you can't do what you want, coming and going, because space, you're right, there's the mission to Mars, there's talk about going back to the moon, because we're going to start to explore our galaxy in the next century. You've nailed it. I mean, if you, it's like the old Royal Navy in the 1700s. If you weren't Britain, you weren't anything. So, anyway.
Well, think about what people need to have a look at is a 1999, if I'm not mistaken, book called Unrestricted Warfare by a couple of Chinese colonels. It was only more recently translated into English, available now widely, Amazon, anything else. But it is the Chinese military and, of course, communist Chinese government concept of what warfare will be like in the decades to come. And it's not just tanks and planes and troops moving across terrestrial Earth. It is every single facet of life, from cyber to economic to financial, of course, to military, political, social. Anything you can think of is all part of unrestricted warfare.
Claire?
Really, folks ought to have a look at that book.
All right, let's hold you there.
Yes.
Because we got to take a break. You guys listening, stay right there. We'll be back with Claire Lopez and more right after this.
Okay, I'm Joe, he's Nick, and you're back in the combat zone. And our special guest tonight is Claire Lopez, former CIA agent and national security, international affairs expert. And you there, Claire?
Yes, here I am.
Okay, perfect. Oh, gee, don't call me sir. I'm starting to feel like I'm back in the Navy again.
So let's talk for a minute about the wall in the South, the government shutdown and all that stuff. My feeling is that Trump is not, and I've been saying this since day one, since the shutdown began, he is not going to back down. He's digging in. This is the fight of certainly of his first term. This would be a Shedwater moment in his presidency, and he is not going to bow to Nancy Pelosi. What are the issues along the border? I think even the mainstream media is beginning to get it now, but just exactly how bad is it down there? Because we can't really trust the mainstream media to tell us the whole truth. Right.
So the United States shares about a 1,700-mile border between our southern border and Mexico, and that runs from our state of California in the far west through Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And there's a variety of geography along that route. Some of it is very inhospitable, mountainous, desert, but some of it is pretty wide open. Some of it is private ranch land. Some of it is national park land. Some of it is native people, their own territory land abutting up against the border. So it's a real variety. In some places, there already exist different kinds of fencing and barriers, and in other places, there's nothing. And for a good part of the border down in Texas, there is the Rio Grande River, the river that divides, is the border boundary line between the U.S. state of Texas and Mexico. But very often that river runs quite low, and people just wade across it at will. In other places that we don't have walls and fences, you've got tons and tons of narcotics being trucked through or carried through by mules, meaning people actually with loads on their backs, backpacks on their backs. And a lot of it is wide open. A lot of the ranchers with private property down along that borderline, especially in places in Arizona and Texas, are terribly vulnerable because they cannot stop the cartel organized drug trafficking that comes straight across their land. If they ever dare to speak up, they'll come home one day and find a note on their sink, their kitchen counter, saying, "We know where your son and daughter pick up the bus in the morning at the corner of X and such streets." This is the kind of stuff that actually happens.
So these people are under a very real threat.
A very real threat, and people have been murdered. Many people have been killed. But the trafficking in drugs, in contraband, in weapons, in terrorists, meaning jihadis especially, gang members like MS-13, it's reached an absolute crisis point across that border. No, this is not about little families trying to escape, poverty and hardship in Central America. There are those. There are some of those, yes. But unfortunately, that is not a legitimate reason to claim asylum in somebody else's country just because your own country is a mess. That is not part of our law, anyway, that permits people to come here just because their own country is messed up. So when President Trump was campaigning on the campaign trail of the presidential election year in 2016, a signature policy of his campaign was the promise to secure our southern border. And he repeated that wherever he went. The crowds responded massively to that, whether they lived across down by the border or not, if they were elsewhere in the country. He promised to build a wall. Now, what's a wall? A wall can be fence, double strands. It can be steel slatted kind of a fence. It can be a number of different kinds of materials used, but the point of it is a barrier that impedes both foot and vehicle traffic of those who should not be coming across that border who are trying to come across that border illegally for one reason or another to cause harm to America and American national security. And American citizens responded, as I said, on the campaign trail and ever since. This is just one of the core, most compelling messages of this president to the American people. There's little that is more important, if anything, than this right now. So what happened is that the president requested a $5.7 billion amount of money from Congress, the U.S. Congress. Financial bills like that have to originate in our House of Representatives, be passed also in the Senate, and then signed into law by the president. That's how laws work, money, appropriations laws, and others too. And so he made this request of the House of Representatives. But even when that chamber of our Congress was controlled by his own party, the Republican Party, over the last couple of years, they didn't pass it for whatever reason. Now, after the elections of 2018, this past year, the House of Representatives has gone over to the opposition party, Democratic Party, control. And they're not about to give this president anything he asks for. They don't care how many Americans die.
Right.
And so we're at this standoff now, the point where the president has said, look, he's been down to the border. He has spoken with Customs and Border Protection. That is our border agency that is under the Department of Homeland Security. He has spoken to ICE agents. ICE stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also part of our DHS cabinet department. He has spoken to sheriffs. He's spoken to ranchers. He's spoken to private citizens. Everybody down along the border is begging for help, relief against the flood of illegals, the flood of gang members, the flood of narco-traffickers, and the president has promised to secure our southern border.
Now, it's interesting.
So he's holding fast.
The interesting thing is,
you're right. He will hold fast.
Right, and the interesting thing is, we keep hearing up here, and I'm sure you're the same thing down there. Opponents of a barrier, whether it's steel or a wall, keep saying that the wall doesn't actually help. We were talking about this last week or 2 weeks ago, I think, Nick. I think that the textbook example of how a wall can be used to stop the influx of people, whether legal or illegal, is the barriers that they built in Israel to stop the encroachment or the infiltration of terrorists in the 10 years ago or thereabouts. Very controversial when they were building it, but it's been incredibly successful at controlling access to population areas, to Jewish population areas. So,
it absolutely has.
It's clear, it's absolutely clear that a physical wall, a physical barrier is very effective at stopping infiltration.
Now,
it is. I've actually been over in Israel multiple times, many times, and I've actually been to the places where the border is between Israel and some of these Palestinian cities like Tulkarem and others that were the source of suicide bombers that used to just come right across onto the buses, blowing themselves up on buses full of school children and everything else. Suicide bombs full of nails and screws, and I've visited the rehabilitation centers where the people who survived, are still to this day carrying nails and screws in their bodies from these bombs. The Israelis put up these walls. In some places they're concrete. They're tall enough and angled enough to stop rifle fire, because what the Palestinians used to do is go up to the top floors of their apartment buildings and shoot down across the border into Israel. So some places it's concrete, tall enough to stop that rifle fire. Other places it's simply double double lines of fencing, electrified fencing, different sorts of materials for different places. Of course, between Israel and the Sinai Peninsula, in the place that used to be called the Philadelphia corridor, Israel has now built very, very effective walls that go down, by the way, deep, many, many meters into the ground and high, and that's in cooperation with the Egyptian government, with the effect that between Israel and Palestinian areas of Judea and Samaria, they have come to stop those walls practically, virtually 100%. There's not been a single suicide bomber coming across there since those walls went up. There are walls all over the place. Hungary built walls along its border to stop the massive influx of these, Muslim male migrants flooding into Europe. Stopped it cold from coming into Hungary. We could go on and on about walls, but they do work. No question, they work. And, of course, that's probably what the Democrats are afraid of. They don't want the wall. They don't want the wall because it would work. It would stop what they look upon as potential future voters, because in places like our state of California, they basically allow anybody, legal or illegal, not only to have driver's licenses, but to vote in elections. Citizens, non-citizens, they don't care. This is what the Democrats are looking for. They are looking for illegals that can be signed up illegally, they don't care, to be voters.
Yeah, I confess
which they think, because of populist policies of, handing out welfare, other people's money, of course, until it runs out, that they'll vote for them.
Well, that's so hard for me to wrap my mind around. I understand the desire for political power. I mean, I'm involved day in and day out in the political process up here in Canada. But it just seems so inconceivable to me that a mainstream political party would be so willing to endanger the demographic, or to change fundamentally the demographic character of individual states in the country in general through illegal immigration, simply because they want to have voters and get power. It's just so hard for me to wrap my mind around it. I'm not denying that it's the case, but it's just I don't know. It's hard for me to.
There are people in all of our countries of the West who literally hate the foundational Judeo-Christian-based principles of our Western civilization. And they will do anything to destroy those principles and the system on which they're based.
Well, you can see that in the recent events of the. You can see that demonstrated in the recent events of the pro-life March for Life down in Washington D.C. 200,000 people show up in downtown Washington, and the press doesn't cover it. And what they do cover is one Aboriginal guy, 30 seconds worth of footage taken out of context. And that's their coverage of these anti-abortionists. I don't mean to open that can of worms. I'm just saying that you can see the loathing.
No, it's perfectly valid.
Well, as a matter of fact, let me put that topic off.
Weekend.
Yeah, let's put the topic off till just after the break, because before we can finish with this one, I want you to tell us how divided the country really is. I'm talking about the U.S. now. About this wall, because we keep hearing the Americans have never been so divided. And I look at this and I think, no, it's you've got the media controlled by left-wing Marxists who are running around trying to convince everybody the sky is falling and that the country's coming apart at the seams. But I don't know if that's necessarily true on Main Street, downtown Smallville, USA.
Well, you're very right. That there are divisions, and the divisions are perhaps best described as the elites. This means the media, as you've just said, but also elites in academia, university campuses, elites of certain political persuasions, versus the everyday, common, ordinary American citizen whose lives are being, just absolutely assaulted by these, illegals who are now flooding into the country, murdering, drunk driving, the drugs, as we've mentioned, raping their way through America. Ordinary, everyday, middle of the country, regular Americans, they're feeling that assault. The elites, they live in gated communities. They don't feel this. What they have are cheap laborers coming into their gated communities and their gated homes to cut the grass. That's what they've got, and it's fine with them. But ordinary Americans, small-town America, as you're saying, on Main Street, they're the ones that have got to put up with the drugs flooding into their communities, or the MS-13 gang members, who, by the way, are all over my own state of Virginia.
Now, let me
so the division is real, but I would say it's between the elites and the ordinary American citizen.
Okay, before
we the people part.
We've only got a couple minutes left, and you've mentioned this name a couple of times, the MS-13 gang. Who are they, and what?
Yes.
Obviously, they're about illegal activity up to and including drug smuggling and murder. But what's their main?
Right.
What are they?
MS-13. Yeah, so MS-13 stands for Mara Salvatrucha 13. That is a gang out of El Salvador that actually found its origins maybe a decade and more ago in California, in Los Angeles, Southern California, and grew as a gang involved in all kinds of criminal activity, but in particular in narco trafficking, but also sex trafficking, human trafficking, child trafficking, the worst of the worst that you can imagine. You've seen these images of these savages with tattoos all over their heads and faces and necks and bodies, throwing gang signs with their hands. That's Mara Salvatrucha, although there are other gangs as well coming out of Central America. But that one is one of the most dangerous, one of the most lethal, and with a foothold and membership in many of the major cities all over the United States. Perhaps they're in Canada too, although I don't know about that. But they're certainly here all over the United States and involved in every kind of the worst criminal activity you can imagine.
Well, I've never heard that.
Horrifically violent.
I've never heard of the gang name before. We do have gang problems here in the capital and in every other major city in Canada. And I don't know that there's any Western country or municipality that's free of gang problems. But these guys sound particularly vicious. And I don't know whether they're here or not.
I'm not positive if they've gone north of the United States into Canada. But they are absolutely all over the lower 48, as we say, United States, 48 states, contiguous 48 states. And as I said, horrifically violent, murders, assassinations. I mean, even rite of passage to become a gang member involves murder, rape, just to become a member. As well as all of these other crimes that we're talking about, especially narco-trafficking, prostitution, trafficking, as I said, of women, of children. It's horrific, and a lot of this comes flooding across our southern border.
Boy, talk about build that wall. I'm hoping that this M13 gang just finds it too darn cold up here. And don't because of where they come from, they just don't like the weather.
Oh, you don't want them. No.
Yeah, listen, don't even joke. I'm finding it too cold up here.
Yeah, and when Canadians start putting their hands in when our politicians start putting their hands in their own pockets, you know it's cold. Okay, when we come back from the break, I do want to get into the March for Life. That 200,000 people in the nation's capital in down there in Washington, no mention of it except for the one I mentioned already that I've seen. And I want to talk about that, everything from security issues to, is the country. The country seems to be becoming more and more pro-life as time goes by. So with that,
All right, we will.
We'll take a break, and we'll come back with Claire Lopez with more on the Combat Zone. Nick and Joe right here. We'll be right back after this.
Okay, I'm Joe, he's Nick, and you're back in the Combat Zone. And I guess it's a good time to remind people that if you want to call in, you can reach us anywhere in North America, toll free. Our number is 844-415-2115. That's 844-415-2115. And, of course, you can always join us in the chat room. In order to do that, very simple. You just click on that chat bubble in the live player online. And if you have to register, go ahead and register. And we're not going to try to sell you anything. It's not our system. Yeah, Nick says not yet anyway. But that's just really to make sure that you're a real live person and not a web crawler or bot or whatever else they call those things. Anyway, our guest is Claire Lopez, and from Claire, what's the organization? Who are you with now, actually? Maybe you could just take a minute to tell us just a little bit about what you're up to these days.
Yeah, so I am Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Washington, D.C. think tank, Center for Security Policy. Our website is www.centerforsecuritypolicy.org, or a shorter URL that goes to the same place, www.securefreedom.org.
Okay, with the 200,000 people descending on Washington for the largest pro-life rally demonstration in North America, I don't think there's any question of that. What does that tell you about the state of the social situation down in the States? Are there any security concerns? Like, when you have 200,000 people, some of them might be tempted with nefarious intent to slip into the crowd and try to do some real harm. So maybe talk to us from that perspective and a little more broadly from your own perspective about what that says about the current situation in the social structure of the United States.
This past weekend saw this very large annual march in downtown Washington, D.C., as always, it's completely peaceful. The marchers carry different kinds of signs and placards, and chant and show their support for life and their opposition to abortion. And so these protests, these demonstrations, marches, draw people from all over the country, and you have all kinds of groups, from civic groups to simply family members to schools that send people for the march every year. And this year it took place this past weekend. No, there's never any trouble. It's always peaceful, although of course there's plenty of security on the streets. So this took place this past weekend. But you're right. The media just do not want to cover it, no matter how important and big an event it is, because the media are lefty, liberal, Marxist, communists, and they don't support the right to life, basically for anybody, but certainly not for the unborn child.
So would I be correct in saying that over time the United States has become more pro-life as things move along?
I think so, and the reason for that, I believe, are medical advances, because as medicine has obviously advanced technologically over the last decades, since the Supreme Court decision called Roe v. Wade, it is now possible more than ever to see the most incredible images of the growing baby, inside the mother by means of sonograms and other medical advances. For example, I've got some young friends right now who are expecting a baby, and they've been sharing with me the sonogram images of their little one, and the detail is incredible. Going back now, they're within 5 or 6 weeks of due date at the moment, but these images go back months, and you can see the little head, the little face. You can see the eyelids. You can see the little one sucking its thumb. You can see hair on the head. You can see fingernails. That's a baby. That's a baby. And as that becomes, more and more obvious through the miracle of modern medicine and advancing technology, and as people begin to realize, the horror of what abortion really is, the murder of a little baby human being, they're becoming appalled, I think, more and more, and more supportive of a pro-life position.
So, because I believe that Canada is following in the same footsteps, like many of the things that you describe are also true here, and I think that's fantastic news, but it's a long, long way. Now, I think another aspect of this, and I'll get your take on it, is that, and I hate to keep, look, Donald Trump is quite a colorful character, and I can't say that I'm a raving lunatic fan of his, but the work he has done more for the pro-life movement since becoming the Prime President of the United States than anybody I can think of in the last, ever since Roe v. Wade. So there's that. I think that Canada is moving in that same direction, and I think it's only a matter of time. But what Trump is doing, at least as I understand it, is the appointees he's making to different judicial benches are conservative, pro-life people, and that's part of the reason why the left hates him so much. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, certainly. That's absolutely so, because many of these judges who are being appointed to federal courts and certainly to the Supreme Court now, President Trump has named 2 judges now to the U.S. Supreme Court, Judge Gorsuch and more recently, of course, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, who are youngish, can be expected to remain on the bench for decades to come, conservative, pro-life judges, and then as well throughout the appellate court system in the United States. And that will have an effect, an impact on judicial decisions, literally, as we've said, for decades to come. And that's the whole point of being careful to select what we call original intent or originalist judges. What that means is judges who will issue judgments in their courts in keeping with the original intent of the founders, those early Americans who wrote our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. And those are the kinds of judges being appointed all across the United States. That will have an impact, yes, for many decades to come.
Now, it's interesting because you think that the legacy of the Donald Trump presidency will be all of the controversy that you see in the public eye, the fight over the border, the partial government shutdown that now is in record-breaking territory in terms of length, the Russia probe, and we haven't even touched on that whole thing. But really, for the people who really appreciate governance, the real Trump legacy, I believe, is going to be exactly what you've just described: the transformation of the judiciary. It's I think, in fact, today that amongst all of the news about everything else, just a little thing that slipped in that I caught was that he appointed another 40, I think it was 42 or 43 judges to lower courts today. I believe that actually is going to be the Trump legacy, and even if it's not recognized as such, I think that this president is going to turn out to have been more transformational than certainly any president in my lifetime.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely agreed. You're right.
Let me shift gears here just a little bit, because we've only got you for about another 10 or 15 minutes. There was an airstrike by Israel against Iran. Why don't you fill us in on that? Because we haven't talked much with all the chaos going on in North America, the border, the China thing and all that sort of thing going on. We haven't really been paying too much to what's going on the other side of the world. So bring us up to speed on what that was all about, what the Israelis hoped to gain by it, and what prompted it.
So over to the Middle East, where, as listeners surely know, over the past 6-7 years, the country that used to be called Syria has been torn apart in fighting. In about 2011, as part of the overall Islamic uprising that swept across North Africa, rebels took up against the brutal dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. And many of those fighting against him were jihadis, Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and various other militias. Bashar al-Assad invited in Iranians who more than willingly sent their Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, intelligence services, and even a number of their mainline army military fighters to help prop up Bashar al-Assad's regime, in the course of which something like 500,000 people have been killed. Millions more have been made refugees, many displaced within the former Syria, but others having fled outside of it into neighboring countries like Lebanon and Jordan. And the result, though, being the increasing influence and dominance of Iran's regime in all of this territory. Certainly we know that the Iranian regime has taken over whatever used to be called Iraq and dominates Baghdad and its government, except, of course, for the part that's broken away in the north, Kurdistan, the Kurdish regional government, KRG. But now, to complete its desired, what they call land corridor, or perhaps Shiite crescent from Iran, if you can picture the geography, through the former Iraq and into the former Syria, and then to the Mediterranean, and then down, of course, to Lebanon, which is already a wholly owned subsidiary of the regime in Tehran, by way of its terror Shiite militia terror proxy, Hezbollah. So the influence of Iran has spread massively over the last 6 and 7 and more years, thanks in large part to the former U.S. administration under President Barack Obama, who was all for allowing the mullahs regime to dominate the Middle East, certainly the Persian Gulf region and beyond. So, bringing back to your question, as these Iranian forces and their proxies have edged ever closer to what is, in fact, their ultimate prize target, that is the Jewish state of Israel, and it's doctrinal. It's Islamic doctrinal obligation to destroy the Jews and the Jewish state of Israel. They're edging ever closer in places that border on Israel's northern border, Lebanon certainly, Syria, what used to be called Syria, the Golan Heights. Israel has been forced increasingly to become more aggressive in defending its own space. In particular, as the militias up there, but Hezbollah in particular, have acquired more and deadlier missiles from Iran, and the technology, even more recently, to attach laser-guided, precision-guided warheads to those missiles, which are a direct and an existential, certainly mass casualty threat to Israel, and really to much of Israel, if not all of Israel. So what we've seen over the last year and maybe a bit more is a more and a more aggressive posture by the Israeli government under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to push back any of these Iranian forces or their proxies away from Israel's northern borders. And that has included Israeli Air Force strikes against not just Hezbollah, but also flat-out Iranian military logistics and intelligence and weapons depot sites inside of the former Syria. And so that's what we saw again this past several days, another massive strike that took out, very near Damascus airport, warehouses, as I understand it, where some of these high-tech advanced missiles and the technology for the precision guidance systems were awaiting transfer from Iran. They're flown in, or they're trucked in across the desert, which is why the land force of the United States was so important, in my opinion, there, the land corridor being established. But also those things are flown in and then transferred over to Hezbollah to use eventually, they intend, to destroy Israel. So that's, in a nutshell, kind of what we're looking at over there.
Okay, so that we can expect more of that as because Iran doesn't understand the word no, don't, or stop. Not
well, they
without...
can't. I mean, it's the obligation of their faith to do what they're doing. Islam demands that this is what they do. This is the commandment of the Islamic faith to destroy Israel and Jews. Never mind, it's in the Iranian constitution as well, including direct quotes from the Quran, verse 860, for example, which says, make ready your forces to the utmost of your ability, including steeds of war, to strike terror into the hearts of the enemy. That's in the Iranian constitution, directly out of the Quran.
Wow.
The whole thing is Islamic doctrine driven. We have to understand that. So, of course, they can't stop.
So now, tell us, in your view, mid to long term, are the Russians going to encourage this bad behavior or facilitate bad behavior by Iran, or are they going to be a restraining influence?
Well, they're kind of stuck in the middle at the moment. Russian objectives for this area, this region, are not identical to what I just described as the doctrinally Islamic-driven objectives of the regime in Tehran. They're not the same at all. What does Russia want? Russia wants its port facilities or its military bases, Tartus, Latakia, and more. Check, they got them. They want an arms client in Damascus, whoever that may be. It could be Bashar al-Assad, but it doesn't have to be. Check, they got that. They want a position of power and influence in that region of the sort of southeastern Mediterranean. Check, they got that. And now they don't want to lose all that. So it's a kind of a balancing act. They want to keep what they got. They've achieved what their objectives are. But they have no intention or desire to destroy Israel, not at all. They want what they've already achieved, the bases, the arms client, the power and the influence in the region. They got all that. So for them, additional aggressive, even recklessness on the part of the Iranian regime could really put those achievements, if you want to call it that, in air quotes, for the Russians, in peril. So the Russians have to tread this fine line, which keeps their position as they've established it there, but not upset the whole apple cart so much to destabilize things so badly that the Israelis really come in and clean the Syrian clock. That they don't want that to happen. So, yeah, the Russians are neither all in for Iran to do anything it wants, nor, though, do they want to see the regime in Damascus overturned. They came in to defend that, and they've done it. So, in the middle.
Wow. That's all I can say is wow. I mean, there's so much to unpack in all that because, first of all, when you're the average snow shoveling Canadian and you hear all this, you think, man, am I glad that's not in my backyard. But it is. I mean, these things, just like in every other world war I can think of, or any other major war, they have a bad habit of spreading. And who knows where, should we get into another hot war with any major, I'm not talking about the Afghanistan situation or things like that are serious, but they're not on the same caliber as World War II was. You've got these people out there and they don't understand how important it is to keep track of all this stuff. And it's mind-boggling just to try to keep up with it all.
Well, come a little closer to home.
Yeah.
Don't the Iranians have an embassy in Ottawa?
They certainly do.
Don't they support all kinds of Iranian population in Canada out of that embassy? Don't they have consulates across Canada? Don't they support out of those consulates that embassy? And let's not forget, they operate out of mosques and Islamic centers too. And what do? They put their people undercover in all of these places. Whom do they put undercover? They put Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, Intel Service, undercover, inside of these diplomatic facilities, the mosques, the Islamic centers, and business fronts, commercial business companies too. For what purpose? Liaison with the Hezbollah cells that are all over North America, United States and Canada too. And what are the Hezbollah cells doing beyond trafficking narcotics, criminal activity, contraband, you name it? They are conducting pre-attack casing and surveillance of Canadian, U.S., and Israeli, meaning diplomatic facilities, targets. All of this is going on in our own countries. It's not just over there.
Well, this is the point that I was driving at, is that it's easy, for people like Joseph and I who spend a lot of time paying attention to this. You don't have to work too hard to make the case about how serious a threat this is. But for your average person, maybe it falls under the category of, don't show me, don't tell me, and it won't bother me. The old, if I don't know about it, maybe it'll go away.
It does, right?
Exactly. Or what's that old saying?
It's not going to go away. It's going to be getting worse.
Yeah. Well, that's how things get worse.
Because it's an obligation of the Islamic faith to do this. I don't think people who are perhaps more secular, more focused on their daily jobs and families and everything else, the details of our lives, we often don't give enough credence and understanding to the extent to which religious belief, faith, controls, dominates, and drives the behavior of other people, of other civilizations that are not Judeo-Christian, Western-based.
Okay,
very, very different than our own.
In the last few minutes that we have here with you, because we have to let you go, let me just give us a quick synopsis, if you will, about some of the stories that are out there that need to be watched, or the kind of stuff we just didn't have time to get into tonight, but are really important. What's out there on the horizon?
Well, we didn't even we haven't even touched on Venezuela, and I'm sure folks up there as well as here in the United States have been following closely the spellbinding what is going on down in Venezuela today. Now, of course, people know that the socialist regime started by started by Hugo Chavez back in 2005. He died of cancer in 2013. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, in power as president since that time, instituted a very populist socialist revolution, as they call it, the Bolivariano Revolution, La Revolución Bolivariano. And that revolution has absolutely decimated what ought to be a thriving, very, very wealthy in terms of land and climate and soil and resources, natural resources, certainly oil, ought to be a model of development. And instead, because of socialism, millennials, y'all listening here, socialism has driven that country into the ground to where the average Venezuelan over the last couple of years, if they're still in the country and they haven't fled, the average Venezuelan has lost 24 pounds because of lack of food. Now, some of us might say, wow, I'd really love to drop a few pounds. That'd be great.
It's not the same thing.
Not when you're starving. Not when you're starving. Not when you can't get baby diapers. You can't get toilet paper. You can't get enough food to feed your family. When you need a bushel barrel full of currency just to go buy, a little bit of milk and bread and eggs. This is Venezuela today. Well, earlier today, the leader of their parliament, the National Assembly, is a rather young man in his 30s, in his early 30s, by the name of Juan Guaidó, and he has declared himself today to be the interim president of Venezuela. People in Venezuela are on the streets by the hundreds of thousands, certainly in Caracas, the capital city, but all over the country and all of its major cities and elsewhere too. To the point that to put this down, if this continues, if the people stay in the street this time and are brave enough to face up to the security forces, it is very possible that the regime of Nicolas Maduro could be overthrown. Finally, many countries and the leadership of the United States, President Trump, our senior officials of the administration, also Canada, also many other countries in South America, including Brazil and Argentina and Colombia and Ecuador and many others, and in Central America too, Guatemala, expressed today official statements of support for the interim president's declaration. So stay tuned. It has already turned violent. Live weapons fire has already been used against demonstrators. There are already casualties. The thing to watch will be the military. Does the military and the Guardia Nacional stay in support of the president, Nicolas Maduro, or do they, who all of them, every single one of them, has a family affected by the collapse of socialism in Venezuela, do they begin to break away? Do they begin to make common cause with their fellow citizens, refuse to fire on them, and take up with the opposition? That's to be watched. And then also to be watched is whether the administration, the Nicolas Maduro government, deploys even more hardcore Cuban, Iranian, perhaps even Hezbollah cadres to put down the rebellion, the revolution. So basically, stay tuned to Venezuela. The best
Wow.
information on that that I've seen is social media, but perhaps folks are watching different things.
Well, Claire, as much as we could talk on that topic for another hour easily, there's so many different threads to it considering the history of South America. But unfortunately, our time with you is come to a close. I want to thank you on behalf of Joseph and I for being our guest this evening. It's always something both of us really look forward to, and I hope that you'll come back and join us again soon.
Sure will. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, good night, Claire, and we'll talk to you again soon. All right. With that said, we'll take a quick break, and we'll be back with the last half hour of the show right after this on the Combat Zone with Nick and Joe.
Okay, welcome back into the Combat Zone. I'm Joe, he's Nick, and you've probably noticed, in case you hadn't all pointed out to you, that I've done all three of the come back into the Combat Zone after a break.
We call those intros.
Intros. Well, I know they're called intros, Nick. But so was the first part where you forgot that I was your partner there.
I was just so excited about having Claire on. She was such a great guest.
Yes, she was, absolutely, and we only scratched the surface of her knowledge.
Oh man,
the depth and breadth of Claire Lopez's experience and her knowledge and her grasp of international and domestic national security affairs is nothing less than profound.
You just take a moment. If you're sitting at your computer and Google Claire Lopez and look at her bio, it will blow your mind.
And you know what was particularly interesting to me, everything she said was interesting, but what struck me was how passionately she got into talking about the pro-life issue.
Yeah.
And which, you don't really think of as a national security issue. And I know that there were these events that occurred in Washington on the weekend. And Nick, and I'm glad you raised them because we see it here in Canada as well on a smaller scale. Of course, the pro-life march annually in the springtime here in Ottawa doesn't attract anywhere near the number of people, but still, 25 or 30,000 people.
Yep.
And it's often ignored by the mainstream media. And, anytime you get 10,000 people marching for anything in the city of Ottawa, that's major news. And so you'll get these guys, again, 15, 20, 25,000 people, and the mainstream media will just ignore them, and it's very odd. So it's almost like 10% of what they had in Washington.
Yeah, and
I was actually, I got to say, I was actually a little surprised that the numbers were only around 200 and some thousand. Usually, I would have expected that the March for Life in Washington was a little larger than that, but maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, the point I think I would make here is that here's Claire Lopez. She's not a pro-life activist by any stretch of the imagination, but she's very passionate about it when she talks about it. And I think that there's an object lesson in that, and that is that there are a lot of people out there who are very much pro-life when you ask them about it. But it's not their main focus in life. They go about their day-to-day lives.
It's not like she doesn't have enough on her plate as it is.
Well, I know, but the point I'm trying to make here, Nick, is that you get accountants and lawyers and secretaries and just people who are not engaged in the debate. And you think to yourself, well, they don't really care, but they do when you ask them about it. So I would say that probably there are a lot more pro-life people. There are a lot more people who are I don't want to say necessarily anti-abortion, but who are profoundly discomforted by abortion on demand like we have in Canada.
Right.
And then the mainstream media lets on. And perhaps those of us who are somewhat active in the pro-life community, in the political arena, really appreciate ourselves.
Well, you know something? I think we fall into the trap of letting the mainstream media dictate terms of the conversation. And instead of, whenever we hear them make some outrageous claim, batting it aside and refocusing the conversation where it belongs, we go, oh, well, it's the mainstream media, therefore it must be correct. When time and time and time again, we're reminded of how biased the left-wing media really is.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm going to challenge you a little bit. I don't know that people think that if it's in the mainstream media, it's correct. I think that a lot of people will recognize that what they're getting isn't the entire truth, if any truth, that there is bias in the mainstream media. I think people recognize it. I think, if anything, the two things that you're up against are, first, that people don't care enough about the issue to roll up their sleeves and get involved in it. They're busy with their day-to-day lives. They have their families, they have the bills they have to pay, and it's tough. It's not easy. Okay, Nick.
Yeah, I do.
But the other thing is, I think the people who think about the media, I think they're scared. I mean, when you look at what happened with that video and the kid from the high school who allegedly confronted this Aboriginal drummer during the March for Life in Washington this weekend, and how that little snippet of a video went viral and how everybody got it wrong, and to the point where the school, not only has this kid and the parents, the family, received threats, but the school also. And yesterday they had to keep the school closed because there were bomb threats. And, if you don't know what we're talking about, Nick will post something on Facebook. But just to summarize it really quickly, I hope he'll paste something, put something up on Facebook.
I won't do it this second.
But there was this a young man who was participating in the March for Life, happened to be wearing a Make America Great Again baseball cap, and which, by the way, you can get those, like any street vendor will be selling them cheap in Washington. By the way, it's an incredibly popular souvenir in Washington these days, even if you're not a Donald Trump fan. So this guy was wearing it, and apparently they were being taunted by some people who were counter protesting there. Quite awful.
Terms. It was. Yeah,
and then this Aboriginal drummer, came up to this kid right up in his face and was banging on his drum. And the kid, he didn't do anything. He didn't say anything. He just was standing there, maybe a little bit of a smirk on his face, but that was the end of it. He was not an instigator whatsoever.
And when is a smirk on your face worthy of this kind of attention?
Now, I got to tell you, on this subject, Nick, I don't know if you recall, I guess it's probably more than 20 years ago, the Aboriginal takeover, the barricades at Oka.
Oh, that's more than 20 years ago.
Okay. And I remember there was a standoff, that the government at that time called in the army.
They did.
And there was a standoff at the entranceway to this Indian reservation. And the Mohawk warriors at the time, they were being very aggressive and being very belligerent, and coming up into the faces of the soldiers. And see, Nick he's pulled up the photo on his computer now, and maybe you could put a link to that or something on Facebook, Nick. And where they were staring each other down, there was this young soldier and a masked Mohawk warrior got into his face, and the soldier was just, maybe a hint of a smirk and just staring and staring. And what I recall from that incident was the immense praise that soldier was given because of the discipline that he showed by not reacting to the taunts and the provocations of this particular warrior.
That was 25 years ago.
25 years ago.
In April of 1990.
And now take that and the great praise, and deservedly so, for the immense discipline that this fellow had shown at that time, this young soldier, and then look at what this young fellow from this Catholic high school was doing in Washington. Essentially the same thing, but everybody jumped all over him and made fun of him and criticized him, and it's really quite appalling.
It is. And the thing about this image that I'm posting right now on the Combat Zone Facebook page is that you have, these are two warriors. The guy with the bandana on was called Lasagna. I don't know why I remember that, but I do. And the other guy was just, I forget the unit. Considering where he was probably with the Royal 22nd Regiment. But he is stone-faced. He is not giving in an inch. He's staring this guy down, and he does it without ever. There was a situation they never fired. There's only one person who was killed at Oka, and that was a cop.
Right. It was
who
the
stormed
police
the barricades.
It was the police that were involved in that. It wasn't the army.
At
first, right.
Right, and that cop got killed. But when the army came along, and this is the difference. This is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about the Canadian military. This is the difference. They could have simply gone in there shooting. I mean, there'd been a cop already killed. They knew the weapons on the site. They could have just bulldozed the place with a tank, put one of those recovery tanks down with a bulldozer blade in the front, push the barricades aside, and let the chips fall where they may. But they didn't. Because there's a difference between when you're fighting an enemy on a battlefield, all bets are off. As long as you follow the Geneva Convention, all bets are off. But when you engage the army against your own population, it had better be a really serious incident. And this was serious. And the army performed beautifully. Nobody was hurt. Only a handful of shots were fired when one guy had his helmet taken off his head, and the natives were the Mohawks were beginning to beat him with it. So somebody fired a few shots in the air to break it up. This could have been a bloodbath. This could have been our Kent University, if you remember from the 1960s when the U.S.
Sure.
Was it
National Guard.
Michigan State National Guard?
I believe it was.
Okay, whatever. But the point is that they could have, this could have gone sideways so many different ways, and these guys performed incredibly well.
Yeah. And another interesting trivia piece about that whole incident, that whole affair, was that the Mohawk warriors that were the militant ones actually weren't even from Canada.
Yeah, they're from New York State.
They had come up from New York State to, take control of that situation.
If my memory serves me correctly, and I may be confusing this with Caledonia, but the local native population were telling the Mohawks to leave.
Right.
They didn't want the confrontation. Now, that was Caledonia.
No, they weren't. No, I'm sure they didn't want the confrontation really here at Oka either. But the Mohawk warriors at that time weren't going to get very far with taking over bridges or anything like that down in New York State, because the minute there was problems, the state police stationed at the either side of the bridges on any of the major highways, armed police. Obviously, the state police would be stationing armed police, and they were camped there. I remember driving between Ogdensburg and Messina, and then to Franklinville and those places right along the south shore of the St. Lawrence River, and all along, every time you came to the littlest bridge crossing a creek, and by the way, that's Mohawk territory for anyone who doesn't know. The state police were there, armed to the teeth, with cruisers on either side of the little bridges.
Yep.
And tents and canopies set up so that people could sit underneath the shade and relax. But they never succeeded in taking on any of those bridges in New York State. So they came up and took over bridges in Canada.
Yeah, but again,
I'm sure I'm oversimplifying, but
yeah, fair enough. But the reason they did it was because the U.S. state police in any given state won't put up with it. They just they move in, they shut it down, and it's over with. There are a few exceptions to that. There's one out west, might still even be going on. It's supposed to be about pipelines and all that stuff out west, but it turns out it's not even on that reserve. But anyway, for the most part, though, they just don't put up with that. Can you imagine a native group in the United States blocking an Amtrak track and actually stopping a train?
Oh, listen,
because they did that here in Canada,
and much more recently. I was going recently. Well, recently, it's been a few years anyway now. But I was heading down to Toronto from Ottawa, driving along Highway 401, and we were coming past Napanee, and the police had closed Highway 401 and were diverting the traffic north by several miles or kilometers, whatever system of measurement you want to use today, Nick. And the reason was because there had been a protest where they'd taken over, an armed group had blocked the railroad. And I'm going, well, what does the railroad have to do with the highway with cars? And the cops said, well, we don't want to take a chance that if there are any shots fired, that a stray bullet might get into the highway, which, was, several hundred yards away. It seemed to me to be a nothing thing. And it seemed to me that the police overreacted at that particular time. But still. Now, interestingly enough, you'd mentioned pipelines, and I'm not going to let the occasion pass without making the observation that you will not get this impression from the mainstream media and the stories that have gone on. But the truth is that there is certainly no unity or unanimity amongst Aboriginal groups with respect to pipelines, oil pipelines in Canada. And there are a number of groups that are actively involved in trying to encourage the construction of pipelines, including in their own territories. So, I only mention that because I know it wasn't a subject that we wanted to talk about, but it may be something to talk about in a future show.
Absolutely.
There is a lot of support in the Aboriginal community for pipelines.
Well, that was where I was going to go next. I wanted to make the point that if you look at the crisis in Oka, they weren't, for lack of a better term, Canadian natives. They were Mohawks from the United States. If you look at Caledonia, the same thing. Not that I'm not trying to whitewash the whole scenario, but I am being careful not to put all the natives in the same basket. Like, I have a lot of native friends. We live near the Golden Lake Reserve. Say what you want, but that's a thriving community, and they have they're doing fine. And there's lots of really well-run reserves around. We only hear about the bad ones. However, that does not excuse, just like you and I could not go out and block a highway because of XYZ reason, no matter how justified we felt. This is where justice has to be blind, and that's why Lady Justice wears a blindfold. That it doesn't matter what your background is, your culture is, where you come from, what you look like, what you do. Those things don't matter in the eyes of the court.
Well, they shouldn't matter.
Okay, I'm saying that in a well-run judicial system,
right?
They don't matter.
Well, the law has to apply to everybody equally.
Exactly.
Or it can't apply to anybody.
Well,
there is no law. There is no law if it doesn't apply to people equally.
Look at Prince Philip. He got in an auto accident. Now, whether you like seatbelt laws or not doesn't matter. That's the law of the land, and he is, one of the Queen's consort. So he's kind of high up there in the rank structure. He should have been charged and ticketed and charged the same way as anybody else would have been, because while he's behind the wheel of a car, although why he's driving it almost 100 years old is anybody's guess. Although I don't know, maybe he wasn't driving. He was a passenger, but he's old enough to know what
my
seatbelt
understanding
laws
is he was driving. I found that a little odd too. And then I thought of my wife's Aunt Peggy, who was driving a car until like 98 or 99 years old. And we'd go down and visit her outside of Lowell, Massachusetts, and she was just a lovely, lovely lady, and fully in command of her faculties. And we go down, and she'd go, "Okay, where are we going out?" She always wanted to take us out somewhere, and she'd insist on paying. I was a beautiful lady, and unfortunately, she fell, and my recollection is she broke her hip, if I'm not mistaken, and then ended up being hospitalized, and it was downhill very quickly from there.
Yeah.
But other than that, she was fully operational, fully within her capacity.
It's funny that you mentioned people that old driving, and that's a whole other topic. But when we lived down in southern Ontario in a little town called Tilbury, I'll make this brief. We were living beside a sweet old lady who was in her late 80s, early 90s, called Mrs. Kenkel. And she seemed fine until you started. My wife would go over and, "Oh, Mrs. Kenkel, how are you doing today?" Make her a cup of tea. And she would be talking to her. And then she'd come out with stuff like, "Well, I just wish people would stop coming into my house and gluing down the strings on my violin." Okay, so dementia of some kind. She still had her 1976 Pinto. It was powder blue.
No, a Pinto.
Pinto.
Oh, dear.
It had 7,800 miles on it. And she would get in her car. She only drove it around town. That's why the mileage was so low. And she backed it down her driveway out onto the street, which is fine. Except that she drifted off, if you're going backwards, she drifted to the right. And the hydrant at the end of her driveway, she was on the grass so far over that she went on the other side of the fire hydrant, if you get my meaning. She did everything but back up straight. It was like a long, curve that a ship might make at sea. And never even crossed her mind how close she came to hitting it. She put it in gear and puttered away. And I'll remember that to this day, that, wow.
Puttered away into the sunset.
Puttered away downtown, yep. Yeah, I know we got to go. But Prince Philip, read his life story sometime. What a fascinating man. He made a lot of sacrifices for Queen Elizabeth.
Okay.
That's it for us.
We'll see you next week.
I look forward to it.